I've been reading books for 15 years or so now, and I can confidently say that reading is not a chore and I really love reading. But things were not always like this. There was a time in my life where reading was a chore. I read not because I had a passion for reading, but because I wanted to become educated or self-developed. So how did I begin reading? I remember trying to begin reading by flipping through pages of the Bible and studying some Ralph Waldo Emerson essays, but neither of those really stuck me into the habit of reading. I haphazardly read the Bible and I read a few Emerson essays, but this was not really a good starting point for me, and I realized what I really needed was a method or a system to approach learning how to get into the habit of reading. The first thing I tried was actually quite fun and exciting, and it was the idea that I could treat reading like meditation. Rather than sit in silence and focus on a flame in my belly that was growing bigger and smaller with each inhale and exhale, I decided, well, I could sit in silence and read a book for 5, 10, 15 minutes, just in different chunks, and that would get me into the habit of reading. Eureka, right? So I thought, great, this is gonna work. I picked up a book on critical thinking, and I remember reading it for 5, 10, 15-minute chunks, and I finished the book. But I soon realized that there was another problem with starting the habit of reading. Reading only self-development books sucked. I highly encourage you, if you want to get in the habit of reading, do not only read self-development books. So many self-development books all say the same thing and maybe use slightly different adjectives and slightly different nouns. You'll hear discipline is key. You'll hear theory without action is useless. Life is tough, get used to it. You always have to implement all the time. Implement. And you gotta make your 1% improvements every day. Blah, 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 blah. It's all the same stuff. It's all repeated in different words. And I was always bothered by the fact that the writing style inside these self-development books, 9 times out of 10, was terrible. It's this kind of writing style that you find really prevalent amongst marketers, and these books were always written like it was written by marketers. And then on that topic, right, which is important to mention here, the outright self-promotion and upselling going on inside the books, 9 times out of 10, it's in the book. You pick a self-development book, they're gonna try and sell you on something else. It's like they're saying like, hey, this information is really important, but what's really important is that you buy more information from me because I really want your money. That's why I really wrote this book. Imagine if Shakespeare was like trying to upsell you in one of his books. It kind of takes away from the book a little bit, in my opinion. So this was making it a little bit difficult to get into the habit of reading because I was just finding that I wasn't mending well with this subject or this area, and it was discouraging. I, of course, realized, and thankfully realized, that not all reading has to be for self-development. In fact, if you're doing a lot of reading for self-development, it might actually be a bad thing. And sometimes the best self-development doesn't even come from the self-development genre. Sometimes it comes from a history book, a finance book, a mathematics book, or even a philosophy book. When I read David Hume, I learned a lot about how I formed my own beliefs. When I read Immanuel Kant, I learned a ton about the nature of my own mind. And when I read Ralph Waldo Emerson, I learned a lot about the nature of my own character. Even when I read biology textbooks, the nature of reality became much more layered, and I understood my place in reality a lot more thoroughly. So what I'm saying here is you can self-develop without reading self-development books. Now, another vital source of my reading life comes from the environment. At some point in time, I came to realize that, environments that are stale, uncolorful, perhaps too still as well, not enough movement or dynamics, were the epitome of uninspirational for me personally. So much so that I actually felt a greater resistance to reading or even working when I found myself inside these environments. So I decided to try reading outside or in a public space, and it changed everything. Economics was way more engaging when I read near a marketplace. Psychology was far more engaging when I read on quasi-busy areas in my university campus. And biology was great to read when there were bugs around or if I was in a garden. So what I am in fact saying here is matching the environments that you read in to the books that you're reading can be a great way to add like another level of excitement to the literature that you're consuming. Something else that got me incredibly excited to read was actually reflection. No, I don't mean taking notes into a notebook, and I don't mean memorizing flashcards, and I don't even mean distributed learning or anything like that. What I mean is pausing and putting down the book and then thinking about like the mechanics or the architecture of an idea, not necessarily the content of an idea. Like here's one example. I remember reading Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks. In one section in the notebook, he talks about classifying and describing different bodies of water. And he talked about a pond, and with the pond, he said when you drop a stone in the middle, the ripples travel towards the crest, or like the outside of the pond. It's always from the inward to the outward. And I thought, well, that's really obvious, but the meta-reflection here, or kind of like the architecture of the idea, the mechanics of the idea, was he simply went out into nature, picked a really minute detail, and gave the most literal description possible. And I thought that that was really cool, and I was really like awestruck by that. Or another great example is Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer, when I first came across him, was like the antipathy of everything I've read in philosophy. And he is a kind of a solipsist. When I went into Schopenhauer, was kind of a direct realist, right? Direct realism being that the mind perceives objects directly in a real, independent world, right? But Schopenhauer kind of flips that on its head and says that, well, actually, the mind is just perceiving representations that it itself produces, and you only ever perceive the mind. It's kind of a solipsism of sorts. And what he's doing here is he's kind of inverting the direct realist assertion. And I immediately realized, wow, you can get some wild conclusions if you invert assertions, right? The idea of just inverting an assertion gets you some pretty interesting ideas. And on top of that, the mechanics of such an idea, right? The mechanics of solipsism would entail that when you love another person, you're really loving yourself, right? And so in some sense, solipsists are all narcissistic, not in the clinical sense, but in like a philosophical sense. That was really interesting. And that level of reflection gave me a whole new layer of excitement that you wouldn't get if you just took notes, right? It's like when you're doing math, you have to think about what you're doing. When you're reading, you need to think about what you're reading and what it implies and the entailments and so on and so forth. You can't just take notes and spit out exactly what Schopenhauer said. You have to be able to make inferences based off of Schopenhauer's assumptions. So don't just be a sponge and spit out information when you're squeezed. Kind of produce new things with the information that you're reading. Now, this last thing is a bit of a curious one, actually, and it was the idea of feeling like a reader. You know, I like to identify as being a reader, but when I thought about the idea of, say, identifying as a student, or as an employee, or as a professional athlete, I kind of realized, well, these people, they do 6 or 8 hours of work, or their task, each day, and I was only reading 1 or 2 hours a day. So if my classification of like self-identity requires that you're doing it for 6 or 8 hours a day, well then can I really call myself a reader? And I've decided, okay, well, let's give it a shot. I'm gonna read for 8 hours a day. So I would pick one or 2 days a week and I would dedicate the whole day to reading. I would sit down for 8 hours, maybe have tea and coffee breaks. I wouldn't eat too much food, and I would read the whole day. And to be honest, it was amazing. In fact, I discovered something about reading which made me even more excited to continue to read further. When I do these sessions of 8-hour reads or 6-hour reads, they give me ideas that I didn't realize I had. And maybe it's because I'm engulfed in someone else's ideas that I kind of combine my own previous biases with their biases, and I get some new biases, like maybe a Hegelian synthesis happens, I don't know. But definitely when I come away from a session of reading for 8 hours, there's some kind of filter that's added to my perceptions that makes the world seem a lot different. And I absolutely love that. It's actually quite addicting. It's kind of like a euphoria. And that is another level of excitement that I have now for reading, right? So I would say if you want to solidify the habit of reading, another thing you can do is pick reading days. Pick days where you have no distractions. You're not going to do anything else. You're just going to read for 6 or 8 hours. So let's summarize all the stuff that we now have and make a brief little list for you, okay? Here it is 1, the environment matters. 2, don't only read self-help books. 3, reflect about the ideas you're reading. 4, have reading days. And 5, treat reading like meditation. I hope some of these work for you. These kind of worked for me over time. I accidentally discovered them, just haphazardly going through things. I would discover, oh, reading in this environment really helped me understand economics better. Or 2, the meditating or treating reading like meditation helped me focus a little bit better. There's probably not going to be one solution that gets you into the reading habit, but the grand philosophy here is to make reading more exciting. Each one of these things that I did made reading really exciting for me, and that's how it kind of stuck with me. And you don't have to do any of these necessarily. The grand takeaway, I would say, is just try and make reading exciting. Whether that's maybe you read a finance book and then go trade some stocks and you make money off of that, and that's exciting for you, right? Maybe that is what makes reading exciting for you. But as long as you can make reading exciting, whether it's one of these tips or not, then I think you will get the habit of reading going. With that being said, guys, let me know what you have to say about this, and bye-bye.